Hi and welcome to Unapologetic Women, a podcast about current affairs, culture, politics, life, and how we got here. Brought to you by Toni and Saoirse. These are unscripted conversations about things we care about, not things we are experts in. Oh, and there's probably going to be a bit of swearing too. So Toni.
Yes.
When I think about the European Union, I think I have a very basic understanding of how the mechanics of that work.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to touch on and dig in with you today on what does it look like to, one, be elected as an MEP, right? A member of the European Parliament. And then what does it look like to actually move policy at a pan-European level that impacts all of these countries that have different cultural backgrounds, different languages, etc. So the whole gamut.
Wow. Do this in 20 minutes or less. God, this is going to be one of those episodes where I'm going to, please, Father, don't listen to me to this because I'm going to get destroyed. You forgot to mention X and Y. Where's the easiest place to start? The easiest place to start is the most important. I mean, again, I don't want to pit them against each other in terms of the European institutions, but the most important in this conversation institution to talk about is obviously the European Parliament because it's directly elected. And so we're going to go back to the fact that today there are 705 members of the European Parliament who are elected. There used to be 751 when the UK was part of the European Union. And obviously post-Brexit with the UK leaving, they also lost obviously and had to give up their members of the European Parliament, the British ones. So there's only 705 left today. In the European Parliament, they're grouped into political families, which I find fascinating because you're grouped within political affiliations, not nationalities. And it's a thing that you'd never normally have to think about because most parliaments are national. But obviously when you're dealing with, 27 member states, I can imagine only the discussion that happened around, are we grouping these by political families or by nationality? And the whole idea here is you're not here to represent Germany or Spain or France. You're here to represent your political beliefs, which is just something that feels very basic, but something that we always forget about because we never have to think about this at a national level. No. So today we've got 705 members of the European Parliament. They're grouped by 7 political families. And then you've got this idea of committees. You've got the Agriculture Committee, you've got the Foreign Affairs Committee, and they meet to discuss specific policy areas. So as a member of the European Parliament, you will be a part of, based on your expertise, part of these different families.
So Toni, just quickly, I heard you say 7 political families. Is that like ideologies? Like what would that look like in the US? We have Republicans versus Democrats.
So, God, great question. So obviously America's a bipartisan model. So you've got the Democrats and the Republicans. Anything that's in between or on the sidelines correct me if I'm wrong, Saoirse, but isn't really taken into account. It is very sort of black and white, left and right system. In Europe, that's not the case. It's very rare to have a bipartisan model. We've got many different political families in every different member state, whether they're conservatives, whether these are the Labour Party in the UK, which is more the socialists. You've got the Green parties. You've got the Liberal Democrats in the UK. So what they've tried to do at a pan-European level is I call it like the MVP. It's like the minimum viable sort of policy or issues that they focus on as a political family, and they'll group them together. So you will have, for example, the ALDE party, which is the Liberal Democrats for Europe, as a pan-European political party. And you'll have the UK Liberal Democrats that are part of that. And then you'll have the equivalent in France, Germany or Spain. Obviously, per country, the values differ. And you can see this even from, let's say, take the UK versus America. American Democrats are not the same as the UK Labour Party or socialists. There's still like a big difference there. So they're trying to take the minimum viable issues that they believe in and kind of group them together as political parties. But yes, it's one of those of trying to make sense of how people come together. And there's been many, and I won't get into the details, but there's been many discussions of why is that political party within that pan-European party and not the other. We think that they're more connected. So those conversations happen like constantly. It's like a giant jigsaw puzzle of trying to put that together.
That is a fascinating model.
Fascinating.
Like when I think about the parties here, they're so vast. Like the Democratic Party, people say that there's 100 parties within it, right? And so this concept of like a political family based around ideologies is just so interesting.
Yeah. And you know what I like about it is it forces people to focus, in my opinion, and this might have not been the intention behind it, but it forces people to focus on what they have in common versus what they don't have in common. So when you're trying to take 27 or a little less, a little more different political parties from 27 different states and trying to pull them into one pan-European political party, you're going to have so much differences. But let's focus on the similarities. What are the ideologies and the issues that all of us care about? Which I think is such a good exercise, and especially nowadays, of focusing on what we have in common versus what we don't.
Seriously.
What else is there to know about the European Parliament? You should also know that it's the legislative branch of the European Union. So I don't know what would you consider the equivalent of that in America?
The legislative branch would be your Congress.
Okay.
How a bill gets passed, yeah.
Okay, so that's your equivalent of the Congress. And then together with the Council of the European Union, it basically adopts European legislation. And the important thing here to know is that the adoption of legislation is always done based on a proposal from the European Commission. So the European Commission is another of the big sort of institutions that you need to know about when you talk about the European Union. It's the only institution that's able to propose legislation. The Parliament can't. The Parliament can ratify and adopt it, but it can't propose legislation. The people who work inside the Commission are like experts in their field.
Oh, wow.
It's also, and I guess we get into this often, but it's also responsible for, the Commission is also, responsible for making sure that the European countries properly adopt European law. So it's often referred to as the guardian of the treaties. And we actually spoke about one of the newest female leaders, which is the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. I'm going to get her name once in a while. So those are like the big ones, the big institutions. You've got the European Parliament, you've got the European Commission who proposes legislation, you've got the European Parliament, who like adopts them and pushes it forward. And they do that with the Council for the European Union.
Okay. So Toni, question for you on like, when did it kick off? When did the European Parliament become an institution? Like, were people fighting at the bat to get involved? Was it I guess we should do this? Like, what did that look like?
Let me take it a step further.
Mm-hmm.
So 1945, you have end of World War II, and the United Nations is created. And it's created with a mission to sort of maintain international peace and security. Like, that's the whole idea of why the United Nations exist. And then you have Winston Churchill a year later that calls for a kind of United States of Europe. So very much based on the model of the United States of America. And he asks for a kind of United States of Europe. And then we have the 9th of May, which is a pivotal day, 9th of May, 1950, which is now considered Europe Day. So actually less than a month from now. And you had this guy called Robert Schuman, and he presents a plan for a new form of political cooperation in Europe. And so his whole idea was to make sure that war between the European nations was something that was unthinkable. And the way he did that was this idea of getting the founding members to sign a treaty to create European institution that would basically pull together and manage coal and steel production. Because when you think about what you need to wage war, you need coal and steel to make arms. You need coal and steel to create bullets. You need everything that you need to go to war is coal and steel. So his whole idea, Robert Schuman's whole idea was, if you pool and manage coal and steel production as founding members, then you wouldn't be able, as a single nation, be able to build the weapons without the other nations knowing. Which means if you can't build the weapons, you actually can't go to war. So that was his whole fabulous idea. Robert Schuman was a French foreign minister at the time. And so his vision starts to take shape. And an important, something that was drilled into my knowledge of are the 6 founding member states of the European Union. And people always mistake and think that the UK was part of it. I often slip back into thinking that the UK was one of the founding members, but it wasn't. And so the 6 founding members are Belgium. God, I hope I get this right. Belgium, Germany. No pressure. Belgium, Germany, France, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Belgium, Germany. Yes, I believe that's right.
Luxembourg.
Tiny Luxembourg.
Tiny.
Yeah, tiny Luxembourg. But those were the founding members that decided that it was more important for countries to work together and to make sure, again, that the war in Europe, or waging war in Europe, was just completely unthinkable. And then throughout the years, you had different treaties. You had the Treaty of Maastricht, Treaty of Rome, and it sort of built on that of what else can we pull together? Can we create an economic union as well? And I'm not going to go through that whole spiel. And then you had the first EU enlargement that included the UK, and that was with Denmark, Ireland, and the UK that joined the 6 founding members, and that was the first enlargement that they did. And then you have the first European elections. And so that brings us to 1979. So that's a fair amount of time later when the European Union as a whole holds the first election. So it's just interesting that we forget the main reason of why the European Union was created, and it was solely created for us not to go to war with each other. And then I think bit by bit, we realize actually we're stronger together. The problems that we're trying to solve know no boundaries, know no borders, are global problems. So actually there's strength in, coming together and creating, what is now known as the European Union. So 1979, first European elections. And this is where, European citizens can vote for who they want to represent them in the European Parliament. And so MEPs were appointed by national parliaments. That used to be the case. Yeah.
So thank you, Toni.
No.
I want to think about electoral process, because as you're talking to me about this now, so it's like, if I'm like, what's participation like? Were people actively involved in it?
What
like actually voting for MEPs? Like, what did that look like? Because I think here to people putting up the requests, definitely back in 2008, of folks saying that the US, everyone in the world should be able to vote for the president in the US.
Yeah.
And so like what was the hunger for that type of participation at a pan-European level?
So it's a hard one because the European elections happen every 5 years. So again, it's similar to US, but it's far-fetched. You're electing people that you obviously probably know very little about in most cases. And they're being put forward by their national member states. And again, I think this is why it's important to think about you're not electing someone based on their nationality, but based on the values and the political parties that they belong with. Because obviously the larger the political, just like in every other election, the larger the political family, the more voice they have, the more chance they have in pushing forward the policies that they believe in. But again, remembering that the European Parliament doesn't put forward policies, the European Commission does, which again is like a good checks and balances there. They get to ratify them and adopt them. But that has always been sort of the hardest thing for European elections, or even for Brussels or any European institution, is it is so far removed from national politics. And I get why people aren't attached to it. And I get why people just don't understand what they're voting for, which is why I think when it comes to European elections, you need to take a step back and look at the grander and the bigger scheme of things. Of why do we need people to have our best interests as one of the 500 million citizens that live in the European Union? Why does it matter? And we forget some of the policies that were put forward, such as roaming charges. There's a reason why, as the European institutions looked at it and said, this is not okay. Our citizens should be able, if there's free movement of goods and people, and our European citizens can travel from one country to another willy-nilly whenever they want without having to show passports, and they can work in those countries, then surely we shouldn't allow national telecoms to charge a fortune and through the roof every time you cross a border. Because in Europe, it's very easy to cross a border without knowing that you're crossing a border. And that happened. And God, I remember getting a surprise bill and my dad losing his actual shit at me going, and I was like, I hadn't realized I was in France and basically roaming. And so that's just a perfect example of a law that was passed with the sole purpose of how can we help our 500 million citizens.
And you're representing, regardless of what your nationality is.
That's
you are representing the whole slot. That's so fascinating.
And that's what's hard, I think, for MEPs or for politicians, is leaving your national beliefs at the door. Like, you're not, and I can't even imagine a world where in America they're not talking about what's best for their own state. But it really is this idea of what is good and what is in the best interest of these 500 million citizens. And so the European Parliament's role is absolutely to translate the best interest of these 500 million citizens into regulations and real policy. And it is there's a reason why it's the largest and most influential legislator in the world, because it's representing that ginormous body of human beings.
So the roaming one is a really good example. Give me another example of what regulational policy looks like at a pan-European level that you'd say would be a groundbreaking piece around who are we as the EU?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, Saoirse, there's so many. I think there's two that are interesting based on the historical situation that we're in today. So look at pandemic. Trying rare diseases is a perfect example. when you look at a rare disease within a nation or nation state, so look at a rare disease in the context of the UK, let's say you might have 100 cases in the UK. And then if you go to Luxembourg, you might have 3 cases of a specific rare disease. And if you go to Germany, you might have, let's say, 400. Pull them all together, and it's no longer just a rare disease of a couple hundred people, but you might have a couple thousand or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. And so it becomes so much easier to make the case to find medicine or a cure for a rare disease that might no longer be that rare because you're pooling the resources and you're pooling all the cases of 28 different member states. So rare disease is a perfect example of how you solve something that might seem less important at a national level that's actually excruciatingly important when you pull everyone together. But because you're not just pooling the number of cases, but you're also pooling together the resources. Healthcare is a tricky one, but healthcare has always been another example of I more or less broke my back skiing in holiday in Switzerland, and I was repatriated. I was airlifted off of the slopes into an airport in Switzerland, taken on a plane from Switzerland to France, then taken from an ambulance, French ambulance from France to Germany, switched ambulances from a Belgium ambulance from Germany to back to Belgium, and ended up in a Belgium hospital. Wow. I was able to do that because of free movement of goods and people. There was no care of what nationality is she and who does she need to be looked after. I didn't have to show my passport once. I was just a European citizen under European healthcare insurance. And my records were translated into 3 different languages.
Wow.
And that's, again, imagine if I couldn't leave Switzerland to Germany and Germany to France and France to Belgium, because every time I had to have a conversation with the national entity or the national healthcare system or insurance to make sure that that was happening. It's just like, and again, like that's a perfect example of repatriation. There's another one. God, what else is there? I know it's a weird, and I'm no expert on this one, but the commission had issued and it's very topical for right now, but had issued a recommendation that the European countries improve their use of video conferencing to help judicial services work better across borders, which is another just perfect example of why is video conferencing software need to be something that's taken care of at a EU level? Well, if you're a bad person, you won't stop at borders either. You're actually going to cross borders. So how can you help? How can the technology be better to help the individual member states keep track of someone who's trying to maybe flee one country or another? There's just so many, basically. The list goes on. And then there's one of our favorite ones, which is GDPR, which was the latest one that we did an episode on that. Was it 2 or 3 episodes ago?
Yeah. We really dug in. And if you have any interest in the GDPR land, make sure to give that a listen.
That was another perfect example of data protection is not a thing that's going to stop at borders. And I can't help but think about CCPA, which was a California act. And I know that American companies are already struggling with that they might have data not just from Californians. And so does CCPA apply to non-Californians? No, it doesn't. Not yet. So what does that look like? Which is just fascinating.
Well, I think there's just so many, like, it's funny you talk about the Winston Churchill piece of like, we want to have a US of the Europe, right? Yeah. Like that federal model is so, what you're talking about are not things that we've been able to replicate in the US, even though, like policy lens, even though that was the model that was replicated for EU. And so it's fascinating to think about what the level of power that a federal government has, but yet the lack of movability in this country when it comes to policy enacting because of this deep divide, but of polarization basically that happens within the US because it is a two-party system at the federal level, right? When you get into local levels, it's different. You have independent parties, etc. So there's so much there in terms of the parallels that we could talk about for days, but just wanted to name that.
It's interesting because we're getting into the nitty gritty or the granular aspect of this as well. But so going back to the fact that the European Commission is the one that, proposes legislation, you've got a bunch of different legislations that are quite interesting just to note. You've got like regulations, you've got directives, you've got decisions, recommendations, opinions, and they're sort of like trying to achieve policy, but some are binding, some aren't, some are apply to every single member of the European Union. Some don't. So it's interesting that they've created like all of these different levels to find borderless solutions. And so I like the GDPR example because I consider it like a minimum viable solution for data privacy, which is annoying because because some countries will expect more. But we also know that France, Germany, Spain, the UK are a couple of countries that have set their aim very high when it comes to data privacy and security. And so you've got the local or the national organizations like the ICO in the UK, like the CNIL in France, who are setting out their own rules. And so the question that I often get is, well, wait, if I obey with the CNIL or the ICO, does that mean I'm automatically good with the GDPR compliance? Or is it something completely different? Like, are there two sets of rules here that I'm supposed to abide with? And again, I think that's the most important piece when you look at it from a federal perspective, like we're doing it social. The idea is we're not forcing, I say we, I'm certainly not, but at a pan-European level, the idea is not to force countries to do something. It's to set certain standards and certain rules so that everyone can follow. And Germany and France might have higher standards, but there's a minimum set of standards that everyone should obey by that allows for the protection of European citizens. Because at the end of the day, that's the only thing that all of these rules and laws are set out for, is to ensure a better life for all.
There's two things that stick out for me. Like in this moment, we're hearing so much in the US of why the federal government is not doing enough for the states as it relates to the pandemic. And we're seeing leaders of each state stepping up. I think of the governor in New York. Like, do you see that in the European sense as well, where like sometimes the EU model fails the national states and you have those individual countries stepping up to lead in whatever fashion and then the EU kind of following along, or is that just kind of more so in the US model?
No, I think it's true as well. And the pandemic is such a good way of putting it into perspective, because I do think this is going to be a make or break moment for the EU of that idea of solidarity. So Robert Schuman that spoke about when he proclaimed in 1950 or 1951, his idea of what he saw like this new federation or union of states coming together. He said it's going to be built through the concrete achievements, which first created sort of a de facto solidarity. And that solidarity is just like so important in this moment. And I think what we've seen with the pandemic is Germany looking after German citizens, France looking after French citizens, Belgium looking after Belgian citizens. And I think we're missing that opportunity to look at the pandemic at a pan-European perspective and look at it for more solidarity. And we saw this if you put it in an American lens, if New York doesn't get their shit together, and not that they're not doing everything that they have to get their shit together, but if New York doesn't solve the pandemic, people are still going to cross frontiers and state lines. And so that pandemic is still, so you have to solve this at an American level. You have to solve this at a European level, because a pandemic, again, knows no boundaries. And so the only way that we can solve this pandemic is by coming together and having that sort of initial sense of solidarity.
It's globalism versus nationalism.
Absolutely. And I get the knee-jerk reaction to wanting to care for your citizens first as a leader of a nation state. Like, I get that. Of course I do. And it's a global pandemic. It's only going to function with a global solution. And that's just one example of many, many, many cases of things that we need to solve today that are global by nature.
And this is a teaser for what we'll be talking about next week.
Yes.
But my last question for you, Toni, how do you deal with the spread of misinformation at a pan-European level, right? So if I'm in Germany and I'm talking my news stream that I've identified from a particular policy from the EU, and I'm in the UK and I have a different lens on it, and we don't need to have an answer to that, but like, that's the thing I've been thinking about as you've been speaking, is like, how do you control what goes out? And should you control what goes out?
And it's interesting because that's such a good lens, even looking at pandemic or GDPR or whatever. The thing that we want to do with misinformation is whack-a-mole. It's like, shut it down. And I think we're seeing that with the pandemic. It's closing borders. Closing borders isn't going to solve the problem at a global level. Now we get why, and closing borders is, I don't equate that to like quarantining and stay inside. But if everyone closes their borders and no one moves, it's not going to help solve the problem. We need pan-European solutions not just shutting down our borders. Because if you shut down your borders, you're also shutting down your borders to help. So what if if you're shutting down your borders, what about the Polish, doctors and nurses who want to come to France to help you or come to Italy to help you? Are you going to let them in? So there's something there that's the same with misinformation is we've got to look at what are those global solutions, not just shutting it down. And I'm excited to dig into that with you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us and for sticking with us until the end. Welcome to all of the new people. Hope you enjoyed your first episode. You can always get all of the episodes at www.unapologeticwomen.co, or you can also follow us on Instagram, and you can find all of these on all of the places you would normally get your episodes. Thank you, and talk to you next week.